Imagine growing up in a place where dreams seem to wither before they even have a chance to bloom. A town where poverty isn't just a circumstance but a cycle, one that few ever escape. For Jacob Miller, life was a battle from the very start. A crumbling trailer park in rural Kentucky, a father who walked away, a mother who worked herself to the bone just to put food on the table. Every night, Jacob lay awake staring at the leaking ceiling, wondering if this was all life had to offer. But deep inside, he refused to believe it. He had a dream, one that seemed impossible, yet he clung to it with everything he had. He wanted more. He wanted out. And most of all, he wanted to prove that where you come from does not define where you're going. This is the story of a boy who defied the odds, of a man who rose from nothing, and of the brutal, relentless struggle to build a future when the world seems determined to keep you down. Jacob's journey is one of grit, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. But the road to success? It's never straight. It's never easy. And sometimes it comes at a cost. Stay with us because what happens next might just change the way you see life. Before we dive in, if you love stories of perseverance, redemption, and the power of the human spirit, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Every week we bring you powerful, life-changing stories that remind us all, no matter where you come from, you can always rewrite your future. All right, let's get started. He was born in Satema's poverty, but life had a different plan for him. The trailer park on the outskirts of rural Kentucky was a place where dreams came to die. The air was thick with the smell of rusted metal and damp earth, and the hum of cicadas was occasionally interrupted by the shouts of neighbors arguing over overdue bills. For Jacob Miller, this was home, a crumbling single-wide trailer with peeling paint and a sagging roof. At just 10 years old, Jacob already knew what it meant to go to bed hungry. His father, Roy, was a man defeated by life. Once a promising high school athlete, Roy had succumbed to alcoholism after a workplace injury left him unable to provide for his family. Jacob's mother, Linda, worked double shifts at the local diner, her hands raw from scrubbing dishes and her face lined with exhaustion. Despite her efforts, there was never enough money to fix the leaking roof or buy new shoes for Jacob and his younger sister, Emily. "Jacob," Linda called one evening as she set down a plate of watery beans and stale bread on the table. "Make." "Sure, Emily eats first." Jacob nodded silently, pushing his own hunger aside as he watched his 6-year-old sister devour the food. He had learned early on that sacrifices were part of survival. That night, as rain dripped through the cracks in the ceiling onto his thin mattress, Jacob lay awake listening to his parents argue in the next room. "I can't keep doing this." "Roy!" Linda's voice cracked with desperation. "The kids deserve better than this." "And what do you want me to do about it?" Roy slurred back. "I'm a cripple. You think I like living like this?" Jacob clenched his fists under the blanket. He hated hearing them fight, but more than that, he hated feeling powerless to change anything. The next morning, Roy was gone. His father's battered pickup truck was missing from its usual spot in the driveway, and all that remained was a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." Linda stared at the note for a long time before crumpling it in her hand. She didn't cry, at least not in front of Jacob and Emily, but her silence spoke volumes. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one defined by even greater hardship. At school, Jacob's life wasn't any easier. His clothes were hand-me-downs 2 sizes too big, and his shoes had holes that let in water when it rained. The other kids teased him mercilessly. "Hey, trailer trash," one boy sneered during recess, shoving Jacob against the chain-link fence. "Did your daddy finally run off? Guess he couldn't stand looking at your ugly face anymore." Jacob's cheeks burned with shame and anger, but he didn't fight back. He had learned long ago that standing up for himself only made things worse. Instead, he stared at the ground and clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. That evening, as he helped Linda fold laundry in their dimly lit living room, she noticed his swollen lip and bruised knuckles from an earlier scuffle at school. "Jacob," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're stronger than they are. Not because you can fight back, but because you don't let their words define you. Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. Sitting alone at the kitchen table under the flickering light of a single bulb, Jacob picked up a pencil and began scribbling in an old notebook he had found in a dumpster weeks earlier. On its torn pages, he wrote down everything he wanted to escape from: poverty, ridicule, hopelessness. But more importantly, he wrote down everything he wanted to become: strong, successful, respected. One evening, not long after Roy's departure, Linda sat Jacob down at the table while Emily played with her dolls on the floor nearby. Her face looked even more tired than usual under the harsh glow of the overhead light. "Jacob," she began hesitantly, "I need you to understand something." She paused as if searching for the right words before continuing. "Life isn't fair. It never has been for people like us, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." Jacob looked at her intently, absorbing every word like they were lifelines thrown into stormy seas. "You're going to face things that feel impossible," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "But you have something your father didn't: grit. And if you hold on to that grit, if you keep pushing forward no matter how many times life knocks you down, you'll make it out of this place someday." Her words ignited something deep within Jacob, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished, despite their dire circumstances. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Jacob carried those words with him like armor against the harsh realities of his world. He worked tirelessly to help Linda keep food on the table, while dreaming of a future far removed from their crumbling trailer park. But even as he dreamed big dreams late at night under leaking ceilings and dim lights, reality continued throwing obstacles in his path, obstacles that would test every ounce of strength and resilience he possessed. For now, though, for tonight, he allowed himself one small moment of hope as he scribbled one final line into his notebook before falling asleep. "One day I'll prove them all wrong." The summer heat in rural Kentucky was oppressive, pressing down on Jacob Miller like a weight he couldn't shake. At 18, Jacob had grown into a wiry young man with calloused hands from years of hard labor. His days were a blur of sweat and exhaustion, working odd jobs to help his mother and younger sister survive. But despite the grind, Jacob held onto a dream of becoming a mechanic and escaping the suffocating poverty that had defined his life. Jacob had always been fascinated by cars. The hum of an engine, the smell of oil and grease, it all felt like magic to him. He spent hours tinkering with broken-down vehicles in the junkyard behind their trailer park, teaching himself how to fix engines with nothing but borrowed tools and sheer determination. Jake, his best friend Tommy, called out one day as they sat on the hood of an old Chevy truck they'd been working on. "You've got a real knack for this stuff. You ever think about doing it for a living?" Jacob wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and nodded. "Yeah, I'm gonna apply for that apprenticeship at Joe's auto shop downtown. If I can get in there, I'll finally have a shot at something real." Tommy grinned and patted him on the back. "You're gonna kill it, man. Just don't forget about us little guys when you're running your own garage someday." Jacob laughed, but deep down he felt a flicker of hope. For once, it seemed like his dream might actually be within reach. A week later, Jacob stood outside Joe's auto shop with his application in hand. His heart pounded as he stepped inside, the smell of motor oil and rubber filling his nostrils. Joe himself, a burly man with grease-streaked overalls, looked up from under the hood of a car and squinted at Jacob. "What can I do for you, kid?" Joe asked gruffly. I'm here to apply for the apprenticeship," Jacob stammered, holding out the crumpled paper. Joe took the application and scanned it briefly before letting out a low whistle. "No high school diploma?" he said, raising an eyebrow. Jacob's stomach sank. "No, sir," he admitted, "but I've been working on cars since I was a kid. I know my way around an engine." Joe scratched his chin thoughtfully before shaking his head. "Sorry, kid. I need someone who's certified or at least finished school, can't take the risk." The words hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. He stood there for a moment, frozen in disbelief, before nodding stiffly and walking out of the shop. That night, Jacob sat on the steps of their trailer with his head in his hands. The rejection replayed in his mind over and over again. Can't take the risk. It felt like all his hard work had been for nothing. Linda came outside and sat beside him, her face weary but kind. "What happened today?" she asked gently. Jacob hesitated before blurting out, "I didn't get it, Mom. They said I wasn't qualified." His voice cracked with frustration. "I've been busting my ass for years trying to learn this stuff, and it still isn't enough." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it reassuringly. "Sometimes life isn't fair," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean you stop trying." Jacob looked at her through tear-filled eyes. "What's the point? No matter how hard I work, I'll always be just some dropout from a trailer park." Linda's expression hardened slightly as she turned him to face her directly. "Listen, to me," she said firmly, "you are more than where you come from, and if one door closes, you find another way in, even if you have to kick it down." Her words stirred something deep within Jacob, a stubborn defiance against the world that seemed determined to keep him down. Determined not to give up entirely, Jacob decided to try another path. Enlisting in the army. It wasn't what he had originally planned for his life, but it offered structure, discipline, and, most importantly, a chance to escape Kentucky. The day he left for basic training was bittersweet. Linda hugged him tightly at the bus station while Emily clung to his leg. "You come back safe," Linda whispered in his ear. "I will," Jacob promised, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving behind more than just his family. He was leaving behind part of himself. Basic training was grueling but rewarding for Jacob. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he had purpose. He excelled at physical tasks and quickly earned the respect of his peers. But just as things seemed to be turning around for him, disaster struck during a routine training exercise. A misstep during an obstacle course left Jacob with a severe knee injury that ended his military career before it even began. Lying in a hospital bed with his leg in a brace, Jacob stared at the ceiling in despair. Once again, life had ripped away what little hope he'd managed to cling to. When he returned home months later, limping and defeated, he felt like a shadow of the person who had left Kentucky so full of ambition. Back at home, Jacob fell into a routine of working minimum wage, factory jobs just to make ends meet. The rejection from Joe's auto shop haunted him. So did the failure of his brief military stint. One evening after another grueling shift at the factory, Tommy stopped by with 2 beers and sat down beside Jacob on the porch. "You've been quiet lately," Tommy said after taking a swig from his bottle. Jacob shrugged bitterly. "What's there to say? Every time I try to change my life, something knocks me back down." Tommy leaned back against the railing and looked up at the stars thoughtfully before saying, "Maybe getting knocked down isn't what matters. It's whether you get back up." Jacob scoffed but didn't respond right away. Deep down, though, Tommy's words struck a chord. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Jacob continued working hard despite feeling stuck in place, his dreams seemingly crushed by one failure after another. But even as life tested him relentlessly, there remained a small ember of hope burning within him, a belief that somehow, someday, he would find a way to rise above it all. For now, though, for tonight, he allowed himself one small moment of reflection as he stared out into the darkness. Maybe Tommy's right. Maybe getting back up is all that matters. By the time Jacob Miller turned 25, life had become a relentless grind. Day after day, he clocked in at the factory, working 12-hour shifts surrounded by the deafening roar of machinery. The work was backbreaking, the pay barely enough to scrape by, and the future looked as bleak as ever. His dreams of becoming a mechanic felt like a distant memory, buried under years of exhaustion and disappointment. But Jacob wasn't ready to give up entirely. Deep down, there was still a flicker of hope, a stubborn belief that he could turn things around if he just found the right opportunity. That opportunity seemed to come one fateful afternoon, when his coworker, Mike, approached him during their lunch break. "Hey, Jake," Mike said, leaning against the wall of the break room. "You ever think about starting your own business? You're good with cars, better than half the mechanics I know." Jacob looked up from his sandwich, surprised. "Yeah, I've thought about it," he admitted, "but it takes money to start something like that, and I don't exactly have a pile of cash lying around." Mike grinned and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled flyer. "There's this guy I know. Real sharp businessman. He helps people get loans for startups. Says it's all about taking risks if you want to make it big." Jacob hesitated. The idea of starting his own auto repair shop was tempting, more than tempting, but something about Mike's tone made him uneasy. Still, desperation had a way of silencing doubt. "What's the catch?" Jacob asked cautiously. "No catch," Mike said with a shrug. "You just gotta trust me." A week later, Jacob sat across from a man named Carl in a dingy office on the wee outskirts of town. Carl was slick, too slick, with a toothy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He laid out the terms of the loan in smooth, practiced tones, promising Jacob that this was his ticket to freedom. "You've got talent, kid," Carl said, sliding a contract across the desk. "All you need is a little push to get started." Jacob stared at the contract for a long moment before picking up the pen and signing his name. It felt like stepping off a cliff, but maybe, just maybe, there would be something soft to land on this time. At first, things seemed to go well. Jacob rented a small garage on the edge of town and started fixing up cars for friends and neighbors. Word spread quickly about his skill and honesty, and soon he had more customers than he could handle on his own. For the first time in years, Jacob felt like he was building something real, something that could last. But success came with its own challenges. Carl's loan payments were steep, far steeper than Jacob had anticipated, and every dollar he made seemed to disappear as quickly as it came in. Worse still, Carl began showing up unannounced at the garage, demanding extra fees and threatening legal action if Jacob didn't comply. "You signed the contract," Carl reminded him one evening, as he leaned against Jacob's workbench with an infuriating smirk. "You knew what you were getting into." Jacob clenched his fists but said nothing. He couldn't afford to lose everything, not again. The breaking point came 6 months later when Jacob discovered that Mike, the coworker, who had introduced him to Carl, had been skimming money from the business behind his back. By the time Jacob confronted him, it was too late. Mike had disappeared with thousands of dollars that Jacob couldn't afford to lose. Sitting alone in the empty garage that night, Jacob felt utterly defeated. The walls seemed to close in around him as he stared at the pile of unpaid bills on his desk. "This is it," he muttered to himself bitterly. "I'm done." For days afterward, Jacob avoided everyone, his family, his friends, even his customers. He spent most nights sleeping in his truck outside the garage because he couldn't bear to go home and face Linda or Emily, with yet another failure hanging over him. One particularly cold night, as snow began to fall outside his truck's frosted windows, Jacob found himself parked outside an old diner on Main Street, the same diner where Linda had worked tirelessly for years to support their family. He sat there for what felt like hours before finally stepping inside and ordering a cup of coffee from the elderly waitress behind the counter. "You look like you've been through hell," she said bluntly as she set the steaming mug in front of him. Jacob managed a weak smile but said nothing. The waitress didn't press him for details. Instead, she pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. "Let me tell you something," she began after a long silence. "I've seen my fair share of folks come through here over the years, some broke, some broken. But you know what separates those who make it from those who don't?" Jacob shook his head slowly. "The ones who make it don't quit," she said simply. "No matter how many times they get knocked down." Her words hit Jacob like a bolt of lightning, simple yet profound in their truth. "You think I can come back from this?" he asked hesitantly. The waitress smiled warmly and patted his hand. "Honey," she said with quiet confidence, "you're still breathing, aren't you? That means you've still got a chance." That night marked a turning point for Jacob. Not an immediate transformation, but a subtle shift in perspective that would set him on a new path. As he drove back to the garage under the pale light of the moon, he found himself repeating her words over and over again. You've still got a chance. It wasn't much, but for now it was enough to keep going. Little did Jacob know that his journey was far from over, and that even greater challenges awaited him just around the corner. The garage was cold and empty the next morning, when Jacob Miller unlocked its rusted doors. The echo of his boots on the concrete floor reminded him just how hollow his dreams had become. The tools he once used to fix cars sat untouched on the workbench, covered in a thin layer of dust. It had been weeks since his last customer, and the bills piling up on his desk were a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. But as Jacob stood there, staring at the mess his life had become, the waitress's words from the diner echoed in his mind. You're still breathing, aren't you? That means you've still got a chance. He took a deep breath and clenched his fists. I'm not done yet, he thought. Not by a long shot. Jacob started small. He spent hours cleaning up the garage, organizing tools and scrubbing away years of grime. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of control, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He also began reaching out to old customers, apologizing for his absence and offering discounts to anyone willing to give him another shot. At first, the response was lukewarm. Most people had moved on to other mechanics, and some were hesitant to trust him after hearing rumors about his financial troubles. But slowly, word began to spread that Jacob Miller was back in business, and this time, he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as Jacob was finishing up repairs on an old pickup truck, a familiar face walked through the garage doors. It was Tommy, his childhood friend who had always believed in him. Jake, Tommy said with a grin, I heard you were back at it. Thought I'd swing by and see if you needed a hand. Jacob looked up from under the hood of the truck and smiled, for what felt like the first time in months. You serious? He asked. Dead serious, Tommy replied, clapping him on the shoulder. I've got some free time these days, and I figured you could use someone to help keep this place running. Jacob nodded slowly. Yeah, I could use the help. With Tommy by his side, Jacob began to rebuild not just his business but also his confidence. Together they worked late into the night fixing cars, brainstorming ideas for attracting more customers, and even repainting the garage's faded sign to give it a fresh look. Despite their progress, challenges continued to pile up. The loan, payments to Carl were still crippling, and every dollar Jacob earned seemed to vanish as quickly as it came in. There were nights when he lay awake in bed wondering if all his efforts would be enough, or if he was doomed to fail again. One particularly rough evening, Jacob found himself sitting at the kitchen table with Linda after Emily had gone to bed. The two of them sipped coffee in silence for a while before Linda finally spoke. You've been working yourself to the bone, she said softly, but I can see it's taking a toll on you. Jacob sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what else to do, Mom, he admitted. Every time I feel like I'm making progress, something knocks me back down. Linda reached across the table and took his hand in hers. You're stronger than you think, she said firmly. And no matter how hard things get, you've got people who believe in you, me, Emily's, even Tommy. Jacob looked at her and nodded slowly. Her words didn't erase his doubts entirely, but they gave him enough strength to keep going. The turning point came one afternoon when an older man named Frank pulled into the garage driving a beat-up station wagon that looked like it hadn't been serviced in years. Can you fix her up? Frank asked as he stepped out of the car. Jacob inspected the vehicle carefully before nodding. Yeah, he said confidently. It'll take some time, but I can get it running like new again. Frank smiled and handed Jacob a set of keys. Take your time, he said. I've heard good things about you, and I'd rather wait for quality work than rush into something half done. Those words hit Jacob like a bolt of lightning. I've heard good things about you. For so long, all he'd heard were doubts and criticisms, but now someone believed in him enough to trust him with their car. Jacob threw himself into the project with everything he had. He worked late into the night replacing parts, fine-tuning the engine, and even giving the car a fresh coat of paint. By the time he was finished, the station wagon looked and ran Like it had just rolled off the assembly line. When Frank returned to pick up his car, he was so impressed that he handed Jacob an extra $100 as a tip. "You've got talent," Frank said with a grin. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That small victory marked the beginning of something bigger for Jacob. Frank told his friends about Jacob's work, and soon more customers began showing up at the garage, each one bringing new challenges and opportunities. But what mattered most wasn't just the money or even the growing reputation. It was the sense of purpose that Jacob felt every time he picked up a wrench or turned an engine back to life. For years, he had let failure define him, but now he was starting to see that every setback had been preparing him for this moment. One evening, as Jacob locked up the garage after another long day of work, Tommy leaned against one of the freshly painted walls and grinned. "You're making a name for yourself again," Tommy said. Jacob nodded thoughtfully before replying, "It's not just about fixing cars anymore. It's about proving that no matter how many times life knocks me down, I can always get back up." Tommy chuckled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Damn right you can." As Jacob walked home under the fading light of dusk that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough or that their dreams were out of reach. Because if there was one thing Jacob Miller knew now more than ever, it was that failure wasn't final unless you let it be. By the time Jacob turned 40, he had spent nearly half his life fighting to stay afloat. The garage, now a modestly successful operation, had become his sanctuary, a place where he could channel his frustrations into something tangible. His customers trusted him, his reputation was growing, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was building something that mattered. But life, as it always seemed to do, had other plans. It began with a phone call late one evening. Jacob was sitting at the kitchen table, going over invoices while sipping a cup of coffee when the phone rang. He picked it up, expecting it to be Tommy or one of his regular customers. Instead, it was Emily, her voice trembling on the other end of the line. "Jake," she said softly. "It's Mom. She's in the hospital." Jacob's heart sank. "What happened?" he asked urgently. "She collapsed at work," Emily explained. "The doctors think it's her heart. They're running tests now." Jacob didn't wait for more details. He grabbed his keys and drove straight to the hospital, his mind racing with worry. When he arrived, he found Emily sitting in the waiting room, her face pale and tear-streaked. "She's stable for now," Emily said as Jacob sat down beside her. "But they're saying she needs surgery and it's expensive." Jacob nodded silently, his jaw tightening. He had spent years scraping by, barely managing to keep the garage afloat and support himself. The thought of paying for a major surgery felt impossible, but there was no question in his mind about what needed to be done. "I'll figure it out," he said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. Over the next few weeks, Jacob threw himself into work like never before. He took on every job that came his way, no matter how difficult or time-consuming, hoping to save enough money for Linda's surgery. Tommy worked alongside him tirelessly, often staying late into the night to help meet deadlines. But no matter how hard they worked, it wasn't enough. The medical bills kept piling up faster than Jacob could pay them off, and the stress began, taking its toll on him both physically and emotionally. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the garage, Jacob sat alone in his office staring at a stack of unpaid bills. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, and for the first time in years he felt truly defeated. "How much more can I take?" he thought bitterly. "Every time I get close to something good, life finds a way to rip it away from me." Things came to a head one rainy afternoon when Carl, the loan shark who had financed Jacob's initial attempt at starting the garage, showed up unannounced. It had been years since Jacob had last seen him, but Carl hadn't changed. Same slick smile, same predatory gleam in his eyes. "Jake," Carl said smoothly as he stepped into the garage, shaking, water off his umbrella. "Long time no see. What do you want?" Jacob asked coldly, wiping grease off his hands as he turned to face Carl. Carl chuckled and leaned casually against a workbench. Just here to remind you about that little loan you took out all those years ago. You've been doing well for yourself. I figure it's time you paid me back with interest. Jacob's blood ran cold. He had worked so hard to put that part of his life behind him, to rebuild after everything Carl had taken from him. But now it was all coming back to haunt him. I already paid you back, Jacob said through gritted teeth. Carl shrugged nonchalantly. Not all of it, he replied with a smirk. And if you don't want trouble, I'd suggest you find a way to settle your debt. Jacob clenched his fists at his sides but said nothing as Carl turned and walked out of the garage. That night, Jacob sat in his truck outside the hospital parking lot after visiting Linda. She looked so frail lying in that hospital bed, so different from the strong woman who had raised him and Emily despite all their hardships. As rain pattered against the windshield, Jacob rested his head against the steering wheel and let out a shaky breath. I can't keep doing this, he thought desperately. I'm trying so damn hard, but it's never enough. For a moment, he considered giving up, selling the garage, walking away from everything he'd built just to make ends meet. But then he thought about Linda's words from years ago. You're stronger than you think. He lifted his head and stared out at the rain-soaked streets with renewed determination. No, he decided firmly. I've come too far to quit now. The next morning, Jacob called an emergency meeting with Tommy. We're going all in, Jacob said as they stood in the middle of the garage surrounded by tools and half-repaired cars. Tommy raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means we're taking every job we can get, Jacob explained. No more turning people away because we're too busy or because their car's too far gone. We fix everything. Tommy hesitated before nodding. Slowly. All right, he said finally. But you know this is gonna push us to our limits. Jacob met Tommy's gaze with steely determination. I don't care, he said simply. This is my family we're talking about. I'll do whatever it takes. Over the next few weeks, Jacob worked harder than ever before, sometimes going days without sleep as he juggled repairs and paperwork, while also visiting Linda at the hospital every chance he got. There were moments when it felt like too much, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. But every time doubt crept in, Jacob reminded himself why he was doing this. For Linda, for Emily, for himself. And slowly but surely, things began to turn around. Customers started pouring into the garage thanks to word-of-mouth recommendations about Jacob's skill and dedication. Tommy stepped up like never before. Even Frank, the man whose station wagon Jacob had repaired months earlier, returned with more business and brought friends along with him, for the first time in what felt like forever. Hope began to bloom again, but deep down, Jacob knew this was only the beginning, and that even greater challenges lay ahead on his path toward redemption and success. Because if there was one thing life had taught him, it was that nothing worth having ever came easy, but some things were worth fighting for anyway. The garage was alive with the sounds of progress, wrenches clanking, engines roaring back to life, and the hum of voices as Jacob Miller and Tommy worked side by. Doodle. It had been months since Jacob made the decision to take on every job that came through the door, and the results were starting to show. The once empty garage was now bustling with activity, a steady stream of customers coming in and out. But success didn't come without sacrifice. Jacob was running on fumes, surviving on little more than coffee and sheer determination. His hands were perpetually stained with grease. His back ached from long hours bent over engines, and his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of treading water. One morning, as Jacob tightened the last bolt on an old sedan, Tommy walked over holding a clipboard covered in scribbled notes. Jake, Tommy said, wiping sweat from his brow, we've got 3 more cars lined up for today, and Frank just called about bringing in his cousin's truck tomorrow. Jacob nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Good, he said simply. Keep 'em coming. Tommy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You know, he began cautiously, you can't keep this pace up forever. You're gonna burn. Out! Jacob looked up at Tommy, his expression unreadable. I don't have a choice, he replied firmly. Mom's surgery is coming up, Carl's breathing down my neck, and I've got bills stacked higher than I can count. If I stop now... He trailed off, shaking his head. I can't stop. Tommy sighed but didn't argue. He knew better than anyone how much was riding on Jacob's shoulders, and how stubborn his friend could be when it came to protecting the people he cared about. Despite the grueling workload, Jacob found moments of hope and inspiration in unexpected places. One afternoon, as he worked on a particularly stubborn engine, a young boy wandered into the garage with wide eyes and a shy smile. Can I help? The boy asked timidly, clutching a toy car in his hands. Jacob looked up from his work and smiled faintly. What's your name? He asked. Ethan, the boy replied. Well, Ethan, Jacob said, gesturing to a nearby toolbox. Why don't you hand me that wrench over there? Ethan's face lit up as he eagerly grabbed the wrench and handed it to Jacob. For the next douleur, Jacob patiently explained what he was doing as he worked on the car, answering Ethan's endless questions with surprising patience. When Ethan's mother came to pick him up later that afternoon, she thanked Jacob profusely for keeping her son entertained. He hasn't stopped talking about cars since we got here, she said with a laugh. You've got a way with kids. Jacob watched as Ethan waved goodbye and felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a reminder that his work wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about building something bigger than himself. As weeks turned into months, Jacob began to see real progress, not just in the garage but in his own life as well. Linda's surgery was successful thanks to the money he had managed to save up, and she was finally recovering at home under Emily's care. You did good, Linda told him one evening when he visited her after work. Her voice was still weak from the surgery, but her eyes shone with pride. I always knew you had it in you. Jacob smiled faintly but didn't say anything. He wasn't used to hearing praise, not after years of feeling like a failure. But her words meant more to him than she would ever know. One day, as Jacob locked up the garage after another long shift, Tommy approached him with an idea. Jake, Tommy began hesitantly, have you ever thought about expanding? Jacob raised an eyebrow. Expanding? We're barely keeping up as it is. I know, Tommy admitted. But think about it. What if we hired another mechanic? Someone who could take some of the load off us so we can focus on growing this place. Jacob frowned thoughtfully. The idea of hiring someone else felt risky, especially given how much trouble he'd had trusting people in the past. But Tommy had a point. I'll think about it, Jacob said finally. A few weeks later, an opportunity presented itself when a young veteran named Chris walked into the garage looking for work. I heard you guys were hiring, Chris said nervously as he handed Jacob his resume. Jacob glanced over the paper before looking back at Chris. You served? He asked. Yes, sir, Chris replied with a nod. 4 years in the Army, worked as a mechanic on Humvees. Jacob studied Chris for a moment before extending his hand. Welcome aboard. With Chris on the team, things began to change rapidly at the garage. Not only did his skills help lighten the workload, but his military background brought a level of discipline and efficiency that impressed both Jacob and Tommy. For the first time in years, Jacob felt like he wasn't fighting alone, and that sense of camaraderie gave him renewed energy to keep pushing forward. As business continued to grow, so did Jacob's reputation in the community. Customers began recommending him to their friends and family. Local businesses started bringing their company vehicles to him for repairs. Even Carl seemed to back off slightly after seeing how successful Jacob had become. But despite these victories, Jacob knew there was still a long road ahead, and that every step forward would require even more hard work and determination than before. Still, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that, maybe, just maybe, he was finally climbing out of the hole life had thrown him into all those years ago. And as he stood outside the garage one evening watching Chris and Tommy joke around while closing up shop, Jacob couldn't help but feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride, not just in himself, but in what they were building together. Because if there was one thing Jacob Miller had learned through all his struggles, it was that success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about finding strength in every step along the way. No matter how steep or difficult the climb might be, Jacob Miller stood outside the garage on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of birds. The garage, now freshly painted with a bold sign reading Miller's Auto Repair, was unrecognizable from the run-down shop it had once been. The parking lot was full, cars lined up waiting for repairs, their owners chatting in small groups or sipping coffee from the corner cart Jacob had set up for customers. For the first time in decades, Jacob felt like he could breathe. It wasn't just the steady stream of business or the growing bank account. It was the sense of purpose that filled every corner of his life. He had built something real, something lasting. And yet, as he stood there watching his team work inside the garage, he couldn't help but think about how far he'd come and how much he'd endured to get here. The turning point had come a few months earlier when Jacob secured a contract with a local fleet management company. The deal meant steady work repairing delivery vans and trucks for one of the largest businesses in town, a game changer for Miller's Auto Repair. The day he signed the contract, Jacob had sat in his office staring at the paperwork for what felt like hours. He could hardly believe it was real. Just a few years ago, he'd been sleeping in his truck, wondering if he'd ever escape the cycle of failure that seemed to define his life. Now, he was running a thriving business with employees who looked up to him, and customers who trusted him implicitly. "Jake," Tommy had said that day, clapping him on the back as they celebrated with takeout burgers in the office. "You've done it, man. You've really done it." Jacob had smiled faintly but said nothing. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. With the new contract came new challenges. The workload doubled almost overnight, and Jacob knew they couldn't handle it alone. Over the next few weeks, he hired 2 more mechanics and invested in new equipment to keep up with demand. Chris, the young veteran who had joined them months earlier, quickly proved himself invaluable, not just as a mechanic, but as a leader who could rally the team when things got tough. One evening after closing up shop, Chris approached Jacob with an idea. "Jake," Chris began hesitantly, "have you ever thought about opening another location?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Another location? We're barely keeping up as it is." "I know," Chris admitted. "But think about it. There's demand out there we can't meet because we're limited by space and time here. If we expand, we could reach even more people." Jacob frowned thoughtfully. The idea of expanding felt risky, especially after everything he'd been through. But Chris had a point. "I'll think about it," Jacob said finally. As business continued to grow, so did Jacob's reputation in the community. Local newspapers ran stories about Miller's Auto Repair and its humble beginnings. Customers left glowing reviews online. Even Carl, the loan shark who had once threatened to destroy everything, seemed to disappear into the background as Jacob's success became undeniable. But what mattered most to Jacob wasn't the money or recognition. It was the impact he was having on others. Over time, he began hiring more veterans like Chris, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives just as he had rebuilt his own. He also started mentoring young mechanics from local trade schools, teaching them not just about cars, but about resilience and perseverance. One afternoon, as Jacob worked on an old pickup truck with Ethan, the young boy who had wandered into his garage months earlier, he realized just how much his life had changed. "You're getting good at this," Jacob said with a grin as Ethan tightened a bolt under his supervision. Ethan beamed up at him. "Do you think I could be a mechanic someday?" Jacob nodded firmly. "I don't think you will be." For Jacob, moments like these were worth more than any paycheck or award. They reminded him why he'd fought so hard to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Because success wasn't just about what you achieved, it was about what you gave. The day of his biggest milestone came unexpectedly. One morning, Jacob received a call from a local business association inviting him to an award ceremony, honoring small business owners who had made significant contributions to their communities. At first, Jacob hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. He preferred working quietly behind the scenes. But Tommy and Chris convinced him to attend. "You deserve this," Tommy said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The ceremony was held in a grand banquet hall downtown, filled with people dressed in suits and evening gowns. A far cry from the grease-stained overalls Jacob wore every day at work. As he sat at his table surrounded by his team and family, including Linda and Emily, he couldn't help but feel out of place. But when his name was called and he walked onto the stage to accept his award, all those doubts melted away. "Thank you," Jacob began as he stood at the podium, holding the plaque in his hands. "I never thought I'd be standing here today, not after everything I've been through." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Life has knocked me down more times than I can count," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "But every time I fell, I got back up. Not because it was easy, but because I refused to give up on myself or on my dreams." The audience erupted into applause as Jacob stepped off the stage and returned to his seat, where Linda hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered in his ear. That night, as Jacob sat on the porch of his modest countryside home watching the stars with Linda by his side, and Emily laughing with her kids inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. For so long, he had chased success thinking it would bring him happiness. But now he realized that true happiness came not from what you achieved, but from who you shared it with. And as he closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of laughter drifting through the open window, Jacob knew that every struggle, every failure, every moment of doubt had been worth it, because they had led him here, to this moment, to this life, to this summit of success that was richer than anything money could buy. For Jacob Miller, this wasn't just an ending, it was a new beginning, one built on resilience, hope, and an iron will that refused to break no matter how hard life tried to bend it. The sun was setting over the rolling hills of Kentucky, casting a warm golden glow over Jacob Miller's modest countryside home. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. Jacob sat on the porch in his favorite rocking chair, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching his grandchildren chase each other across the yard. Their laughter filled the air, blending with the soft rustling of trees. At 60 years old, Jacob felt every bit of his age in his bones, but his heart was light. For the first time in his life, he wasn't consumed by worry or weighed down by the struggles that had defined so many of his years. He had built a life he could be proud of, a life filled with purpose, love, and meaning. Inside the house, Linda was busy preparing dinner with Emily, who had grown into a strong and capable woman in her own right. The smell of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread wafted through the open windows, mingling with the sounds of family chatter and clinking dishes. "Grandpa!" Ethan's voice called out, pulling Jacob from his thoughts. The boy, now a teenager, bounded up the steps to the porch, holding a greasy wrench in one hand and a smile on his face. "I fixed it," Ethan exclaimed proudly. "The lawnmower's running again." Jacob chuckled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Good job, kid," he said warmly. "Told you you'd get the hang of it." Ethan beamed under his grandfather's praise before running back to join his siblings. Jacob watched him go with a smile, feeling a swell of pride. Ethan reminded him so much of himself at that age, curious, determined, and full of potential. But unlike Jacob's younger years, Ethan would grow up with opportunities and support that Jacob had fought so hard to create. After dinner, as the family gathered around the living room for stories and laughter, Jacob found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The walls were lined with photos, snapshots of milestones that told the story of his journey. The grand opening of Miller's Auto Repair, Linda smiling after her successful surgery, Emily's wedding day, and even a framed newspaper article featuring Jacob as one of Kentucky's most inspiring entrepreneurs. One photo in particular caught Jacob's eye, A picture taken at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Miller Mobile Mechanics, his second location that Chris now managed full-time. Expanding had been a leap of faith, but it had paid off in ways Jacob could never have imagined. The business now employed dozens of people, including veterans like Chris, and served communities across multiple counties. "Dad," Emily said softly, interrupting his thoughts as she sat down beside him on the couch. "You okay?" Jacob nodded and smiled at her. "Just thinking," he said simply. "About what?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," he replied honestly. Emily laughed lightly and shook her head. "Lucky? Dad, you've worked harder than anyone I've ever known to get here." Jacob shrugged modestly but didn't argue. He knew she was right, but he also knew that luck had played its part too. Meeting Tommy when he needed a friend. Finding Chris when he needed help. Hearing those simple yet powerful words from a waitress all those years ago. "You've still got a chance." Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed except for Linda, Jacob stepped outside to sit, on the porch once more. The stars were bright against the dark sky, twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. Linda joined him a few moments later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she settled into the chair beside him. "You've been quiet tonight," she said gently. "Just thinking," Jacob replied again. Linda smiled knowingly. "About everything you've built?" Jacob nodded slowly, but then shook his head slightly. "Not just that," he said. "About everything we've been through to get here." Linda reached over and took his hand in hers. "It wasn't easy," she admitted softly, "but we made it." Jacob squeezed her hand gently and looked out at the horizon where the hills met the sky. "You know," he began after a long pause, "there were so many times I thought I'd never make it out. Times when I wanted to give up. But you didn't," Linda said firmly. "No," Jacob agreed quietly. "I didn't." He turned to look at her then, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Linda smiled warmly and leaned her head against his shoulder as they sat together in comfortable silence. The next morning brought an unexpected surprise. A letter from the mayor's office inviting Jacob to attend a ceremony honoring local leaders who had made significant contributions to their communities. "They're naming a park after you," Emily exclaimed as she read aloud from the letter at breakfast. Jacob blinked in disbelief. "A park?" he repeated incredulously. "Yes," Emily said excitedly. "They're calling it Miller Park, to honor all your work with veterans and young mechanics." Jacob was speechless for a moment before finally managing to say, "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Tommy chimed in with a grin as he sipped his coffee from across the table. Jacob laughed lightly but nodded in agreement. "All right," he said finally. "I'll go." The ceremony was held 2 weeks later on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the newly dedicated Miller Park. Hundreds of people showed up, friends, family members, customers, employees, and even strangers who had heard about Jacob's story through newspapers or word of mouth. As Jacob stood on stage accepting the plaque bearing his name, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for this moment, but for every struggle that had led him here. "Thank you," he began as he addressed the crowd. His voice was steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "This isn't just about me," he continued after a pause. "It's about everyone who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Everyone who reminded me that no matter how many times life knocks you down, you can always get back up." The crowd erupted into applause as Jacob stepped away from the microphone with tears in his eyes. That night, as Jacob sat once more on his porch surrounded by family and friends under a blanket of stars, he realized something profound. Success wasn't about money or fame, it was about resilience, about love, about leaving behind something that mattered long after you were gone. And as laughter filled the air around him once more, Jacob Miller knew without a doubt that he had lived not just a good life, but an extraordinary one, built brick by brick through sheer determination and an iron will that refused to break no matter what challenges came his way. For Jacob Miller, this wasn't just an ending, it was everything he'd ever dreamed of. and more.